Perfect. Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to have Kain here with me. For a quick intro about myself, I've been working on Chainlink for a few years now, and right now working with the ecosystem and seeing how we can keep expanding and working with projects to create a better, more secure crypto ecosystem. Maybe you can tell us a few words about yourself.
Hey, Johan. Thanks. Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm Kain, founder of Synthetix. We have been working with Chainlink for a very long time on a bunch of things, but primarily oracles. And more recently, I've launched a new project called Infinex, which is a new front end for Synthetix. And we've got some interesting stuff that we're working on there as well.
Perfect. All right, let's discuss this, Kain. So today, we live in a world where DeFi, which has been built for years and to which you've contributed a ton with Synthetix, right, only has a few million users, while centralized exchanges, Binance, Coinbase, etc., are at a few hundred million. How do we get DeFi to 10x? How do we start competing with the size of centralized exchanges today?
Yeah, so I think one of the positive aspects of the bear market is to see the level of activity that is actually happening still in CeFi, in crypto. There's still a ton of trading volume. There's a ton of users. It's just we don't have as much on-chain activity as we did, during the bull market. But each time a market cycle, wave crests and crashes, where the kind of lows end up being higher, right? So we have higher lows. And so I do think that there is huge opportunity during this bear market as we're building in DeFi to go after and try and capture some of those users who are using CeFi products and try and transition them without even needing to get any new users. The last bear market, there were so few users that trying to, capture users from some other group of people was kind of a pointless exercise, really. It was quite hard. But now I think we actually do have a ton of users who are still in crypto, in spite of the bear market. And there's a big opportunity for DeFi to go after them. I think there's some specific things we need to do to go after those users and convince them to try DeFi. And that's kind of a separate point, but it's a very positive thing. I think that we have so many users that are addressable to DeFi that are still in the space.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think there is no trend that's linearly up, right? You go through ups and downs, up and downs, and as long as the up right now is still much better than where we were in a few years ago, right? So a few years ago there was no DeFi, nothing was built, right? And today we have an ecosystem, people are transacting every day. Now, in my view, in order to actually get to the point where DeFi is the leading ecosystem, we want to become the point of entry for new entrants into the space, right? So right now, whenever I get into DeFi or into crypto as someone who's never used this ecosystem before, I go to a centralized exchange. How do you think we can change it? How can DeFi become the point of entry for new entrants into the space?
Yeah, and this is a critical point, right? So, there are crypto users, crypto believers who are still here in the bear market, who still primarily transact on databases, on centralized databases controlled by, centralized entities like Binance and Bybit and OKX and all of those exchanges. And so the question is, okay, how do we bring those users over? We need to be at feature parity with the exchanges. We need to be able to have the same liquidity, the same user experience, the same functionality, all of that stuff. And I think that in the last 6 months, there are multiple different derivatives exchanges, and obviously Uniswap for a long time has had I think an advantage on the spot market for a lot of assets, for the long tail of assets. But I think particularly around derivatives, it's been the last 6 months where we've reached feature parity on like the trading execution side, right? And so the missing component for me has been the usability side. Because it's still easier to use a centralized exchange than it is to use DeFi. And so one of the things that Infinex is working on is to bridge that gap, to get to feature parity in terms of usability. And one of the ways we're doing that is to remove the need for bridging, Another way is to remove the need for you to sign transactions. And then probably the primary one is the onboarding one, to answer, I guess, your question directly. When you sign up for centralized exchange or any Web 2 platform, whatever, the expectation from a user is you put your username and password in. You create an account, you have a username, an email, password, and that's how you get onboarded. And so changing that behavior to something where you're signing an on-chain transaction, setting up a MetaMask wallet, setting up a hardware wallet, has been a heavy lift. And of course, there's some people who are deeply technical who are happy to, kind of transition to that model. And it is a better model fundamentally. But for the vast majority of users, that process of transitioning them is quite difficult. And so what Infinex is looking to do to capture these users is to basically remove all of the friction, all the onboarding friction, test out this idea and test out this approach on the existing users who are in the ecosystem currently, so that when we do get back into a bull market, we're positioned that new users coming into the space flow through to DeFi instead of flowing into CeFi. That's really the primary goal. The current users, fine, great, amazing. We can test things out. It's the new users in a year or 18 months or 2 years who start flowing into the space. We do not want to have another cycle where 95% of the users flow through to a centralized database where they can get robbed.
Yeah, I think every one of these bull markets is actually, or these cycles, right, is actually an opportunity to onboard much more users. So what you have to do during the bear is actually build the infra that ensures when these people get into the space, they go in toward protocols that are actually achieving decentralization, achieving what the space is about, right? The vision of the space, right? So DeFi needs to be built during bears so that you're ready during bulls. That's kind of the cycles I've seen, and it's kind of what you're building within Infinex, basically. Now, how do you think, so beyond the UX and all of these improvements you guys are bringing, how do you leverage what DeFi has to offer? So all the great things we've learned with DeFi, all of this explosive growth you can achieve, all of these incentive mechanisms, right? So how do you leverage those to make Infinex as easy to use as a centralized exchange, while still leveraging all of these network effects we know and we love with DeFi?
Yeah, and this is the difficult part, I think, threading that needle, right? The primary thing for me is really improving the onboarding flow, right? And the kind of day-to-day user experience of interacting with a DeFi-powered app, right? The back-end infrastructure is DeFi. The front end, uses a database and, is performant and responsive. But the front end is where there's very little risk, right? The front end doesn't hold your funds. The front end doesn't, control access to your assets. It doesn't, it doesn't do anything that's sort of high risk, right? It's the back end infrastructure that does the high risk stuff. And so for us, it's kind of, finding a way to do that. And I think once we get to feature parity in terms of usability for users, that's when we can switch on the DeFi, flywheel, right? And really start to leverage all of the power of DeFi, because we have access to every single DeFi protocol in Infinex, right? And obvious examples would be for margining, right? If a user wants to be able to margin their position with some random token, right? There's two ways to approach that. If you're a centralized exchange, you need to build a margining engine from the ground up, have all of these risk controls, have all of these processes in place to ensure that margining engine functions well, liquidations happen in a timely fashion, that, there is some kind of insurance fund or something to protect users. All of this stuff is really, really hard, right? With Infinex, we can just tap into a combination of Aave, Compound, some other lending protocol, where all of that hard work has been done over the last 5 years and the infra is there, right? And we can say, yeah, if there's an asset that you can deposit into Aave and you can borrow USDC with it, you can margin your position using that asset. And so being able to tap into the back-end infrastructure that's been built over the last 4 or 5 years in DeFi and not having to rebuild everything from scratch the way that a centralized exchange needs to do is a huge, huge competitive advantage. But it only works if you get the usability side, the onboarding side right. If you onboard people to this new idea, then you can take advantage of the tech.
Yeah, I think this makes a ton of sense. You don't have to recreate the wheel every time. You can leverage what's been built. It's it's um it's basically transposing what you have with open source with coding, right, over to infrastructure and over to liquidity. Because actually, what happens in exchanges most of the time, well, all the time actually in central exchanges, you have siloed liquidity, right? So this exchange liquidity doesn't communicate with this one, doesn't communicate with this one. And you can't leverage any infra, obviously, right? So you can't leverage liquidity, you can't leverage infra. Here with DeFi, and that's been the magical thing with DeFi, which in my view has allowed it to grow so much. I could have Synthetix USD, use the Synthetix USD into Aave to then get some loan, etc. Right? So you could leverage all of the pieces together, create composability. And right now, what you're building, which I think is extremely interesting, is an exchange which can actually access all the global liquidity out there, right? So you can address every single market, all the value that's currently on chain in a way that centralized exchanges can never do, because those exchanges are basically islands. There is no interoperability from one exchange to another to create some type of liquidity pool, right? So that's really the beauty of DeFi. It's kind of quote unquote open source liquidity. Like everything can be reused, everything is composable. On our side, in the last few months, we've been doing quite a lot of work with CCIP to actually bridge institutions, banking institutions over to the crypto world, right? So the idea is, how can we actually bridge these two worlds, the DeFi world and the more digital asset, real world asset world that banks are leading and institutions are leading, right? How do you think about this capital inflow from the usual big players, the banks, the institutions? How will they will kind of overlap with the DeFi ecosystem? How will they interact with it?
Yeah, I think it's a complex issue right now for a whole bunch of reasons, right? Regulatory issues, technical issues, overall macro financial issues, right? And I've been, I guess, a real world asset skeptic for a while, but over the last year, I think I've started to get a level of comfort that some of the experiments that are being run are starting to pay off, and we're seeing that there are ways to onboard real world assets that give you some kind of hybrid of the security that you have from on-chain activity, and probably security is critical, but also distribution, right? The ability to take a real world asset and get a level of distribution that you can't really get in the traditional finance world, because every single jurisdiction in TradFi is siloed, right? And there's intermediaries that sit in between them, right? Whereas DeFi is a global phenomenon. It operates on a global network, and so the distribution to me, I think, is quite interesting. And then obviously security is critical as well. And I think it's only been in the recent, like in the last year, they've started to put those things together. And we're starting to see some interesting experiments play out, and starting to see demand for real world assets. Back in the day, a lot of the use cases, in my mind, just didn't work out that well. Tokenizing car loans or something like that. There was a lot of counterparty risk. It was unclear. It wasn't transparent. So you lost the transparency. I think when you have the transparent ability to bring this up on chain, it really starts to open up use cases. But if it's done in an opaque way, where there's like some centralized entity that's bringing something on chain, I think you lose the magic.
Kain, as a question, with all the blocks coming together, right, as you said previously, so we have the DeFi blocks, we're starting to see the real world asset blocks, we're starting to see a path at least to how Web 2 and Web 3, so how the TradFi system and DeFi can interact together. What are the things that most excite you about the next few years, right? So you're working on Infinex, you're betting on mass adoption. What do you think? How will everything play out in the coming 1 to 2 years?
So, this is a bit of an esoteric answer, I guess, but I think, finance and most human coordination is sort of a social construct, right? It's what we all collectively believe becomes real, right? And in TradFi, the social construct is that we are reliant on ultimately courts, right, to decide and arbitrate. We're reliant on regulators to arbitrate between counterparties, and ultimately, courts are relying on sort of physically enforced mechanisms, right? So if someone steals your stuff, then they can be put in prison, right? Or if someone breaks the law or commits fraud or whatever, they can have their physical freedom taken away, right? And I think that system has kind of built up over a long time, right? There's layers and layers and layers and layers of social constructs that are built into that system, and at the kind of top layer, in terms of how information flows and how counterparties are matched, and how the actual financial engineering works, right? We're still using a bunch of 50-year-old legacy COBOL boxes that are stitched together, right? And I think that if we can replace a lot of that financial infrastructure with open blockchains and bring assets on chain, it doesn't mean that we don't necessarily have some reliance on the legal system or whatever, because ultimately physical items are always going to be controlled by kind of a physical meat space process, right? Whereas digital assets can be purely digital, and the enforcement can they can be bearer assets that are enforced digitally. The rules can be enforced digitally, but as soon as you have a house, it's a physical thing in the real world, right? And someone can turn up and seize it, or whatever. So but I think the fact that all of these things are a social construct can allow us, and there's been a lot of skepticism about this, but can allow us to bring the mechanisms for transacting on these things and transacting these assets on chain. And I think that today we are just starting to see the first glimmers of that, right? People getting comfortable with the idea that you can transact in a real world item on chain, and that is as valid a way of transacting as transacting with a bank, or transacting on Sotheby's, or transacting on some legacy institution for matching counterparties. And I think that to me is going to be the huge shift as people get more comfortable that transacting in digital items, regardless of whether they have a physical representation or not, is going to be this huge shift in the world and how the world transacts, and it will make it global, and it will be global because it is composable, because the networks are open. And so predicting what will happen there is impossible in my mind, but predicting that it will change how we transact and change how we coordinate with one another, I think is obvious. It will absolutely transform that. It's just a question of how.
Sorry. Yeah, fully agree with you. I think that's really the vision of this space, right? So the vision is, let's bring infrastructure that actually forces transparency, right? So when you digitize assets, when you start transacting on the systems you've created, the transaction and the rules of the game will be transparent. There is no obfuscation on what's happening. There is no obfuscation on what the rules are. So creating a financial transactional system based on our infrastructure, based on blockchain technology, right? That basically enforces verifiability, that creates accountability for the participants, right? So when you go on an exchange now to trade, there is no surprise around what the backing of the exchange is. There is no surprise around what the collateralization is. It's all on chain. You know the rules. You know what the rules are, right? You can't be cheated as easily. And I think this concept of enforcing accountability in the space is very important, because with technology, right, and with finance and with everything in life, you have good and bad, right? So any technology can be used for something good. It can be used for something bad, right? So we see it with AI today, right? So AI has some really wonderful applications for the betterment of humanity. It also has a lot of points, a lot of potential to go badly for us, right? To enforce things you don't want to see enforced. With crypto, what crypto forces, what the blockchain ecosystem forces, is accountability. And this accountability for people who create the technology reduces the potential for bad action, because now there is no obfuscation. there is no lack of transparency. You're now playing on the same playing field where you're forced into transparency, right? So I think that's really the beauty of the ecosystem we're creating. One is it forces transparency. The second one is it forces, it breaks down the silos between countries, silos between jurisdictions. Blockchain allows a global world, right? A global world of transaction, a global market. And these two things, in my view, are really hope for humanity, right? Forcing the whole system we have today on a global scale to abide by transparency and forcing accountability on all the big players, that's gonna ensure that we get more good out of our technology than bad. And that's why I think you, me, and a few people who've been here for a few years are so excited about the potential we bring to the world.